Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. Hello, Tim.
How are you?
Fine, thank you. So we've got a really terrific guest today. But before that, I want to talk about crime. And just about every survey you read on what Californians are concerned about, among the top three is always crime. And we've seen a tremendous rise in violent crime and retail theft in recent years. And as our senior fellow and criminal justice expert Steve Smith says, the data is far from being accurate because, frankly, a lot of people just stop reporting crime because they don't have a lot of confidence in our system of justice.
That's right. And, a lot of people, when you think about crime, we're policy insiders. We follow these things. But I think a lot of people have the question, well, how did it get so bad really so quickly, right? And as Steve writes about in his study, Paradise Lost, which our listeners can download at pacificresearch.org, there were a lot of well-meaning but really bad policies that were enacted during the decade of the 2010s. And you may have heard of laws like AB 109, and you may remember voting on laws like Prop 47 and Prop 57. Cumulatively, those laws, plus some changes that were made during the COVID-19 pandemic. There were some executive actions that were taken to, prevent the spread of the virus in prisons, which amounted to a lot of people being granted early release. And, what you had is cumulatively this impact of, retail theft on the rise. As Steve documents in Paradise Lost, over 1 million crime victims, and that's every kind of crime you can imagine. And that's obviously a low number. And so while the proponents of these policies and politicians, a lot of politicians who are the adherent to these bills at the Capitol, try to say, well, the numbers show we're safer and it shows there's no impact. Well, we all feel it every day. We all see it every day. Crime is so much more prevalent in our lives than it has been in any time in recent memory. And, usually 1 + 1 = 2. If you have massive policy changes and a very negative impact, usually the cart follows the horse. I think if you're interested for kind of a good background on this issue, highly recommend that you read the Paradise Lost study or listen in a couple of weeks. We're going to have from our recent Sacramento policy conference, we're going to have a great panel discussion that Steve moderated with some of the top crime victim advocates in the state. And you'll really get an insider's perspective of how laws are making it very difficult to achieve justice for crime victims and their families, and how the laws are making it very difficult for prosecutors to do their job to keep people safe.
That's right, Tim. And not only is it hurting individuals, but it's also limiting the prosperity of the state. You're starting to see businesses close down in some of these crime-ridden cities. We're hearing Target, Starbucks, In-N-Out, 7-Eleven, Macy's, Walgreens, Whole Foods. The list keeps going on of retail firms that are abandoning the cities. And that's not good for the populations of these cities who need these kinds of services, like especially a Walgreens and a Target and some of these grocery stores. And, overall, I think there's among the criminal justice community, especially some of these soft on crime prosecutors, you're seeing perpetrators of crime back on the streets after a day or two. Prosecutors in some of the big cities are more concerned about the rights of criminals rather than the rights of crime victims. Police departments are having trouble keeping up with the crime. They are having a hard time recruiting police officers. So there's a lot of issues in our system now, and it's brought us all to this moment.
And you're starting to see even those who are the biggest adherents to this way of thinking in the legislature are starting to catch public heat and are starting to reverse course. We're seeing, and there's a terrific blog out this week on our Right by the Bay blog by Steve Smith on the new legislative effort to deal with retail theft. We're all experiencing that, and it's one of the prime reasons why you're seeing places like Walgreens and CVS and Target and others closing closing their stores in droves in California. So the real world impact of these policy changes are now bubbling up finally to heat on the politicians who made these changes. And we're having to reverse course on some of the greater excesses of these laws that are complicating our daily lives and negatively impacting our quality of life. So this week on the podcast, we have a very interesting guest, former Assemblyman Mike Gatto, who was an assemblyman representing the Burbank, Pasadena area for several years in the 2010s. And he tells the story of the tragic murder of his father. And it's really a case that hasn't been solved yet over a decade later. And he has a new book out that talks about his case and what he and his family have been going through. It's called Noir by Necessity, which you can get at Amazon.com or your favorite online bookseller. And so we have a really interesting conversation with Mike going through as a policymaker who becomes a victim of crime, going through the story, going through what he experienced with the ups and downs of the case, his interactions with law enforcement, how it impacted his life both his family life and his life as one of the top policymakers in Sacramento. It's a tragic yet very compelling story. And I think you'll all, if you're interested in these issues of California's crime challenges, or if you like kind of real life crime books and programs, I think our interview with Mike Gatto today is for you.
Yeah, Tim, what struck me about this interview was a fact that Mike Gatto mentioned to us, which is 55 to 60% of murders are never solved. I was just bowled away by that fact that he mentioned in the interview. And when you think about it, I won't, spoiler alert, his father was murdered. It didn't seem to me like a Columbo story with twists and turns. It seemed pretty straightforward, and you would think that by now it would have been solved, but it hasn't been. And it's a very compelling, profound story, and you really have to feel for him and his family of what they went through. So for our supporters, if you haven't already signed up, we have a dinner with Steve Moore, our annual Baroness Thatcher dinner, April 10th. And this year it's at the Pacific Club in Newport Beach. All the information is on our website, so please join us. And here's Mike Gatto. Mike, we're thrilled to have you on Next Round to talk about your powerful new book, Noir by Necessity, which our interested listeners can pick up on at Amazon.com or their favorite online bookseller. But before we talk about the details of your book, share with our listeners why you decided to write a book about your father's murder and the aftermath that you lived.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. I decided to write this book because during the 10 years that my father's case has stretched, I have come to know dozens and dozens of victims or family members of victims. And, it made me realize something going through this myself. And that is, we all have a sense of how many murders and other crimes go unsolved. But until you really dive headfirst into it, like I have, you might not realize how many different families out there and the human toll of what it takes on them to be waiting for answers in their case. Now, I'm lucky enough to have a platform. I am so fortunate that I have a Twitter following and I can go on the news and I can be on a podcast like this. But most families of murder victims do not. And so what I wanted to do is write a book that talks a little bit about the victim experience of what family members go through, so that for everybody out there who's waiting for answers in an unsolved murder, that it will sort of educate the public a little bit of what we're going through.
So, Mike, take us back to that fateful day in November 2013 when your father was murdered. How did you find out? And what were some of the both painful and unusual things that you experienced in the hours and the days after your father's death?
It was November 13th of 2013, and I had been at the Capitol that day. I had some meetings about the Asian citrusillid, and I also met with one of my former colleagues who wanted to run for speaker, and I was just talking with my staff and things like that. And went home that evening, pretty uneventful night. And that evening, I got a call from my little sister right about the time that we put our kids to bed. At that time, I had two young daughters, and I got a call from my sister. And I don't remember if she called once and I didn't pick it up, but at some point I thought, she doesn't usually call me at this time of night, so I picked up the phone. And she was hysterical. She had, as one can imagine, I mean, she had gone to my dad's house. She had found him slumped over in his bedroom. And initially, she wasn't sure, I guess, that he was dead. Apparently the room was dark. And you have to understand, my dad was in his 70s at the time, but you have to understand he was in the peak of health. So none of us expected that he would die. He was a guy who sprinted upstairs and he, would deadlift fig trees. And I mean, he was just a very, very, very healthy guy. He also, his family had some people who lived very long. We still have a number of cousins who are in their late 90s and still alive. And so we just didn't think that he would be dead, right? And so my initial reaction was, well, we'll call the paramedics, first of all. And she did, and the paramedics came and they confirmed that he was dead. And I think at some point people turned on some lights and they realized that he had been shot. It wasn't obvious from what they tell me. There wasn't a lot of blood and things like that, but I don't remember who confirmed it with me, if a paramedic got on the phone or a police officer or one of my friends who had driven over, or if it was my sister. But at some point that night, they confirmed that my dad was dead and that the cause of death was almost certainly murder.
Mike, you had to do one of the most painful and emotional things a person has to do, which is to give a eulogy for their parent. It's quite eloquent and beautifully written, and you print your words for your father right in your book. So tell us briefly, who was Joseph Gatto? What kind of man was he, and what values did he instill in you and your family?
Well, thank you. He was really a fascinating guy, because I kind of joke he was like the last Renaissance man, right? He was very much, somebody who could take apart an engine and rewire a house, and he could do advanced carpentry, and he knew how to prune trees and how to farm and all these things that a lot of guys don't know how to do anymore. But at the same time, he was an artist, right? He loved painting, and he loved making jewelry and things like that. And I try to explain this to people of a younger generation, and I'm not sure that they grasp it, but he was in many ways a starving artist, except different from how people are today. Because people today, if you want to be an actor, if you want to be an artist, well, you do it. You just do it. It doesn't matter if you're going to make money or not. It doesn't matter if you have a family. It's all about you. My dad was the opposite. For him, everything was about duty. He served 4 years in the Army. When he got out, he started focusing on having a family, married my mom, had us 3 kids, and he just worked. I mean, he had 3 jobs. He would get up every morning at 5 a.m. He would prepare his lesson plans for teaching. He would go teach. We'd come home, change clothes real briefly, and then go to his job at Dodger Stadium. He sold peanuts at Dodger Stadium at the night, and concerts and special events. So it was about 200 days a year. And then on the weekends, he had a 3rd job. And he did this for 45 years and, make sure that the kids were raised and that the family had money. And it was only when he retired that he started to think about his art career again. And the sad thing for him was that it took off. He, at the time of his death, he was actually becoming quite renowned for making craft jewelry. And, you always wonder what could have been. But those generations had a different sense of duty. And so when I think about the values he instilled in me, it's really a sense of duty, right? I try to take that same approach with my family. And also, I try to be well-rounded or I don't know, a throwback or whatever you want to call it. I mean, I try not to be unidimensional. And so I try to do a lot of varied things and try to know how to do a lot of things, because that's the type of guy he was.
So reading through the book, it really reads in some ways like a real life crime drama that you could watch on TV. And so describe some of the failed leads that you and the police pursued early in this investigation. And really more as I was reading, I wondered, how did you emotionally handle all of the ups and downs of this case as you were going through it?
Those are great questions, and let me try to answer them as best as I can and unpack, because there's a whole lot there. So first of all, I mean, the the relationship with some of the detectives on the case was kind of curious, I'd say, from the beginning. They were, I later learned that some of the detectives on the case were not, I guess, considered that terrific even from their employing department, which was the LAPD. They had a kind of curious bedside manner at times. I recount in the book how one of them scolded me for one of my votes on a piece of legislation. Like this was like 72 hours after my dad's murder. And it was just kind of strange. And there were things like that made the relationship a little bit difficult. But all through the investigation, and this has continued to this day, because I am a public figure, and certainly then because, anybody in the world can contact me, right? When you're an elected official, that is your life. You want people to contact you. You have a government webpage that says, if you need a pothole filled or if you want to express an opinion on legislation, send me an email, right? Because of that, and because I was out there, asking the media for help and the public through help, I got contacted by dozens of people. And I recount some of these stories in the book, dozens of people, both friends and strangers, who had elaborate theories about my father's case. Everything from, I had, and this, the crazy thing is this happened several times. I had people call me and say, there's a guy who looks just like the sketch that the police published of a person of interest in your dad's case. He's outside of my house right now. We would all drive over there, police would come, everything like that. And then it would just be, there's a homeless guy sleeping outside and I want him gone. And so, yeah, I'm sorry. I just, this is the only way to get attention. Had that happen. I had an actress. She's been on a lot of soap operas and she's, some people would know her name, contact me. She knew my dad tangentially. She had an elaborate theory that she had to tell me over lunch. She would only tell me in person. I was very excited. When we got there, the theory was basically that Hillary Clinton had did it. I had so many of those things happen. And I wondered, was it just the high profile nature of this case or was it something else? And I realized it's probably a mix, right? If you're the relative of somebody who got murdered in a small town and it's unsolved, you probably encounter your share of crazies as well. There's probably people who say, gee, I hate Jimmy. And they go up to you and they say, I think Jimmy did it. Right. And with me, I just was accessible in this gigantic community that we call Los Angeles in California. And so I got all those people seem to come out of the woodwork and tell me their axes to grind and their wild theories. It's hard. I can't lie to you about that. It was emotionally very hard because when people call you with one of these theories or people call you with a tip, they don't lead with the wacky stuff. It's not, if someone called me and said, hey, I've got evidence that it was aliens from Mars or Hillary Clinton or something like that. Well, you hang up the phone, but people would say, hey, listen, I knew your dad. I have a tip. I think you need to hear this. I can't tell you on the phone. You have to come to lunch with me. Right. And so, while you're waiting for the lunch, you're like, oh my God, this is the tip that's going to break the case. And I'm so excited. And there's anticipation. And then you get there and you're like, oh my gosh. Right. So that happened a lot. It is challenging. Though it's challenging with the crazy tips, it was also challenging with just the ups and downs of different things that were, false leads. People thought it was this or they thought it was that. And, still after 10 years, nothing has led to any.
Mike, you describe in the book some very revealing and sometimes awkward conversations you had with detectives investigating the case, especially about the crime law AB 109. AB 109 is one of the controversial laws we document in our study Paradise Lost on the criminal justice policy changes during the 2010s. Describe some of those conversations and the inner turmoil that you had in casting a vote on AB 109 and thinking about it afterward.
Excellent question. So I sort of alluded to that in a previous answer, and the best way I would sum it up is the detectives were probably absolutely right on substance, but they were kind of wrong, I think, on the timing. So we family members had to tour the crime scene and try to help the detectives if anything was amiss and what was missing and all that stuff. And this was, like I said, maybe 72 hours after I had learned my dad had been murdered. I don't think I had slept a lick. And, they took me aside and basically scolded me about AB 109. And they said, your dad's killer could have been an AB 109er. And by the way, you voted for them. And I mean, they were, like I said, probably wasn't the right time. Would have loved to have that conversation with them anytime but then. But as I write in the book, they were probably right on the substance. AB 109, as you two know, was a very controversial law. The Governor Brown euphemistically called it realignment. What it really did is it took people who were hardened criminals who had been sentenced to state prison, and it realigned them to county jails. The theory that was sold to us in the legislature, because I did vote on it, the theory that was sold to us was that, there's some guy and maybe he's in a hard luck county. And I gave the example of Humboldt County. The paper mills all closed and his dad and him were out of job. And so, he turned to dealing cannabis back when it was illegal. And, he got sentenced to state prison, which was far from Humboldt and away from his support network and away from his girlfriend and his mom and all this stuff. And so he becomes a hardened criminal. That was the theory. The fact was entirely different. The fact was that most crimes are committed in, 5 or 6 counties in California. These are the big counties, the big urban counties. And the jails in those counties are completely full, and they always have been. And they probably always will be. So, you would have somebody who was a totally hardened criminal, who lived in Oakland or committed a crime in Oakland or Los Angeles or San Francisco or someplace like that, who would get sentenced to, to state prison under the old regime, who is now sent to county jail. And the county jails had certain rules in place, both state and local, that said, well, if we're too overcrowded, we just let people go. So what they literally did was just let these people go. And it was a vote that I did not want to vote for. I wrestled with it. It was just an awfully vexing vote. But, of course, Governor Brown and the legislative leadership tied it to the budget. They made it part of a budget trailer bill. And at that time, and I think to this large degree today, it was, you vote for the budget or you lose everything. You lose your ability to be effective for your constituents. You lose your committee assignments. You lose your ability to get bills through the legislature. And so there's a balancing act that a lot of people go through, which is, pure intellectual and ideological purity versus more of a realpolitik. And look, I made the decision to vote for AB 109. I've regretted it ever since. What I talk about in the book is that balancing act and how, this decision really, was thrown in my face and, some might say rightfully. But what I try to tell, lawmakers or anybody considering going into politics is, obviously consider the actions of your vote. Very few people do that. And number two, if your gut is telling you not to vote for something, then just don't vote for it. I changed a lot. I was already considered, an eclectic voter when my father was killed. But, after that, my attitude was I'm going to vote for things or not vote for things based on my life experience and what I think is right and my morals and what my constituents want me to do. And if you're going to pressure me, then, I won't say the phrase that I probably can't say on a family program, but I changed and it was like, look, if you're going to have a problem with it, then you're going to have a problem with it, but you got to do what you think is right.
So even though the case initially centered on a man who was likely high, breaking into cars near your dad's house, you had a lot of questions and doubts really from the beginning. So what were some of those doubts and, what caused you to feel that way?
Yeah, so the way that my book, Noir by Necessity, is laid out is I wanted to be laid out, besides telling the story of what victims' families go through, I wanted it to be laid out in such a way that people would understand how victims' families learn about clues, the false starts, the positive leads, all those things. And frankly, I also wanted to crowdsource my father's crime. I mean, there's a lot of people out there who are true crime aficionados. There might be people out there who are amateur DNA people or whatever, but I laid out the book so that everybody knew every clue that I got ever. And the ones that remain in force, but, I'll sort of walk people through what we learned and why I have doubts with it. So maybe it was 4 days after my dad's killing, or maybe it was 3, I forget. But there was a lady in the neighborhood who came forward and she said that, on November 12th, which is the day that the police think my dad was killed, that she had been coming home from her son, taking her son to karate. And the neighborhood my dad lived in was shaped like a football stadium. And I know people say, what? But you have to kind of picture it. It's called Silver Lake. And at the bottom of the football stadium where the playing field would be, there's a lake. It's a reservoir. And then, around it, as you can imagine, there's sort of the rings of a bowl. And, and there are a few little tiny streets that you can picture to be like aisles rails at a stadium that connect the different levels, right? So just like a stadium, right? And my dad's street, which was a little tiny aisle street, it only had 3 houses, and it, kind of went horizontally between the different levels. Was laid out that way. And this woman had been driving at one of the higher levels, the cheap seats, if you will, in the stadium. She had been driving home that day, and she had seen a guy breaking into cars. And she had called one of her neighbors and said, "Hey, there's a guy breaking into cars." And she and this man kind of eyeballed him and kind of chased him. And he ran away. He ran down a walk street. Again, this neighborhood of LA has walk streets. They're like staircases that connect the the different levels. And this guy had run down a staircase to another level. And they gave chase. They drove around the streets in a loop, and they tried to find him. And her son, who was very young at the time, had thought he had seen a gun. And so based on this, she came forward and said, "I can't help but thinking this doesn't have something to do with the murder of Joseph Gatto." Again, it was a high-profile crime. She lived in the neighborhood, and the police called in the man next door. He did not see the guy's face. They asked the young boy to make a sketch. He sort of, did the best he could, and that was all we had to go for. But it was something, right? So we put that out to the public. Here's a sketch. I later learned that the sketch was, again, the adult hadn't seen him. The mom couldn't draw a sketch. It was only the boy. I also later learned that they hadn't seen a gun. Only the boy had. So, we don't know if this was connected. For years and years and years, this was the dominant theme. And I kind of feel like a fool because I went out to the public and I said, we think the guy was, 19 to 25 years old and might have been a neighborhood kid. And this is what he probably looked like. And, but I mean, after all these years, we don't know if this was just a random guy breaking in cars. But the theory was, right, that if a guy was running through the neighborhood towards my dad's house with a gun at roughly the same time that he got killed, that this wasn't a coincidence. And so for years and years and years, the detectives on my dad's case, they just said this was Occam's razor. You had a guy who was running through the neighborhood with a gun towards my dad's house, and that my dad ended up dead. They thought it was this guy, and they thought he might have been a druggie who was looking for a quick fix. But I started to have a lot of doubts with this, and I go into these in exhaustive detail in the book. For those of you who love mysteries, I mean, I hate to say it, but this is a real life mystery, right? Number one, if a guy ran away from, well, first of all, why was a guy breaking into cars packing a gun? You turn what's a misdemeanor and probably a slap on the wrist, a day in jail, into a felony. Number two, if you have a gun, why don't you just hold somebody up? There were 10,000 joggers jogging around the Silver Lake Reservoir at any given time. Well, just hold somebody up, stick them up, grab their purse, or go somewhere else and do something like that. Number three, if this guy was such a hardened criminal that he would kill my dad, why did he run away from a mom driving her kid home? Why didn't he do something nasty then? Number four, how did he get into my dad's house? There's no signs of forced entry. The police had a theory, right? And it's amazing how even, career detectives will fit something to their conceived notion. They said that basically my father was the victim of horribly bad luck. So right around the time this guy's breaking into cars, right around the time that people are coming home from work, which is odd behavior, woman confronts him, he runs away. He must have been right-handed, so he turned right. That's toward my dad's house. He must have thought my dad's tiny street was an alley and he could hide, and so he went running down into it. My dad, who had bought a printer at Costco that day, and we know that from the Costco video and his receipts, he must have been coming down to his car to get the printer out right at that time. He couldn't get it out of the side door, so he must have had to open the hatchback. He must have had to open the garage door at that precise time. The guy must have heard, and again, this is the police's theory, there was a tour helicopter going to the Hollywood sign at that exact moment, and the guy thought it was an LAPD helicopter. So at that precise moment in time, my dad was closing the garage door. The guy ducked into my dad's garage and got in with no forced entry. Now, for this to fit the timeline, because, my dad was on his computer until I think 7:30 that night. For this to fit the timeline, the guy would have had to sit in the garage for an hour, not take anything. This is a car thief or somebody who steals stuff out of cars. There's 3 cars at my dad's house. He didn't try to drive away with any of them. He didn't take anything. He didn't just open the garage door and leave. Instead, he chose to go into an inhabited dwelling. Again, rather than taking stuff on the first floor or the second floor, he goes up to my dad's 3rd floor bedroom and kills him. This is, and by the way, and this is the most gruesome part of things, but I do need to share it because it's another reason why I just don't believe with this timeline. He would have had to kill my dad, perhaps with an accidental shot, but then he would have sat there while my dad died, my dad bled to death, and he would have ransacked my dad's third floor bedroom with a dead body in it, with my dad dying, with my dad sitting, by a phone. I've seen enough of these movies, at that moment, the guy wouldn't know if my dad was really dead. He wouldn't know if he would suddenly wake up and call 911. It's just so weird. So much of this is so strange to me. There were also facts of the ransacking that just didn't seem to meet with reality. And so I could do a whole show on the doubts that I have with this theory. It just doesn't make sense. Somebody who's a minor criminal, you violate all the rules of minor criminals by going into an inhabited dwelling. It just doesn't make sense to me. And so I just don't give much credibility to that theory.
Mike, so throughout all of this and the first years after your dad's death, you were a powerful legislator chairing the Assembly Appropriations Committee. So how did your father's murder, and you alluded to this earlier, how did your father's murder influence your work, if at all, at the Capitol?
Yeah, I was at the peak of my legislative power when my dad was killed, and I still had quite a bit of influence until the day I left the legislature, many years later. And I tried to be a voice for all victims, and I tried to be a voice for law enforcement, and I tried to be a voice for things that I thought would help people who were in a situation like mine. There was a period, for example, a couple of years after my dad's killing, where a court in California decided to strike down California's DNA testing laws. The police had DNA in my dad's case, or they have DNA, and so that was something that I tried to work on. And I also tried to make sure that whenever there was, one of the more extreme bills that was going through the legislature, that I tried to be a voice of reason to my fellow Democrats and tried to explain to them why oftentimes these efforts at reforms were done with the mind of people who had been convicted of crime, and they really weren't done with victims in mind. And so, aside from what I said earlier, where I was a little less concerned what people thought about me. They could call me whatever they wanted to call me. They could threaten to take away my assignments or my bills or my power. I just felt like this really crystallized how I had already been, which is that at the end of the day, you've got to hold your head up high. You got to look in the mirror and feel like you voted for stuff that you really believed in. So that was one of the things that was one of the ways that affected me. That was substance, right? There was also ways that my dad's murder affected me very, very negatively, of course, because of what it did to my political career. My dad's case was, for me, practically a full-time job for many, many years. And I hid it from my staff, and probably the only person who knew was my wife, because, number one, I was getting all these tips all the time, and I was obsessing over it, and it was not healthy. But I felt like, if I could only collect more evidence, if I could only try to logic stuff out more, if I could only reach more people, if I could only talk and find more people who might have been eyewitnesses and so on and so forth, that maybe this would be the break that solved my dad's case. My dad also, like many people, obviously he didn't expect to die. His personal affairs were in horrible order. He hadn't redone his will for years and years and years. His house was, disorganized. He didn't expect to die. And so there was a lot of work just sorting through his stuff and doing things like that. And so, I feel bad sometimes that for some of my latter years in office that, I wasn't as focused as I could have been. I tried my best to juggle everything: my constituents, my legislative responsibilities, my family, my kids, and then obviously my dad's case and my dad's estate. And it was a lot of work. And then, when I termed out, I had to decide whether I was going to run for the state Senate or whether I was going to run statewide. And I was sort of vexed between both. But then, the continued unsolved nature of my dad's case and how much work it was, coupled with my wife, with a joyous event, which was my wife getting pregnant finally with our third kid, who we've been trying to have for a number of years at that point, it made me press pause on my political career. It just made me think that it would be better to just primarily be there for my family in many different ways. So that's how my dad's murder really affected politics and my career, and and in some ways continues to this day.
we're now more than a decade, really, since your father's passing, and there's still no resolution in the case. So, can you bring us up to date a little bit? What are some of the more recent developments in the case, and are you hopeful that you are going to have a resolution someday?
Well, I am hopeful. Someone joked with me that they're not sure if it's hope or faith, but it's a mix of both. I remain hopeful that I will have a resolution. The police certainly think that we will. They always tell me it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and that is good to hear. But at the same time, it has been 10 years, and memories fade, and witnesses move away, or things like that. But the what blows me away is I'm continuing to learn aspects of my dad's case. I right after he was killed, I used to talk to the detectives every day, and then it became like once a week, and then once a quarter, and twice a year, once a year. And, now I just sort of talk to him like once a year. But at the last sit down that I had, the detective told me something that I didn't even know the whole time, which was that my dad likely fought back, that there are signs that indicate that he fought off his assailant, and or at least tried to. And those details become a piece of the puzzle. But yeah, I believe that every little bit of information does matter, and that at some point, I'm not sure if anybody will come forward. I hope that people will read my book, and maybe some folks in the neighborhood who have not come forward but might know something might. I did detail in the book, for example, that the police know for a fact that there is somebody who saw the primary person of interest. This is the guy breaking into cars, because when the people that I described, the three people, were chasing him down those stairs initially, there was a woman walking up the stairs, and he went right by her, and she must have gotten a clear look at his face. And it's amazing because my dad's neighborhood is a very small world, and this rocked the neighborhood. It was the only murder that year, and I don't think there's been one since. And it's amazing that she would not have come forward, because this was front page news of the newspaper, plus television broadcast news every day for like 30 days, right? So and that's one thing. I do hope that some folks might come forward. You also wonder if there was the profile that they have, this 22-year-old kid living with a grandmother in the neighborhood who might have been behaving weird that night, and then disappeared later, went off to live with cousins in Georgia or something. Again, someone might jog something. They might come forward and say, oh yeah, there's a kid who was acting really strangely in November of 2013, and he moved away right after. Those type of things could possibly break the case open. But in terms of recent developments, the sad thing is there really haven't been any recent developments that change anything. We still have a very, very mixed, strange assortment of clues. And I go over all of them in the book. We have this weird profile of, maybe a kid, maybe from the neighborhood, probably high on drugs, maybe looking for a fix, my dad, the victim of bad luck. Or we have, some other theory, right? That maybe this was, somebody who my dad knew, possibly somebody who was very elderly, like my dad, which is interesting and intriguing. Possibly there's something more to it. Possibly this is something much more vastly complex. But there have not been any new developments, and that's another thing that I kind of talk about in the case is there's just so much time you spend waiting and wondering. You wait for it to get a call that there's a DNA match, or there's a fingerprint match, or somebody came forward, or we got a guy in custody and he confessed, or and none of that has happened in my dad's case. And let's say this because we alluded to it early on, but we did not say it directly, the statistics, which is roughly 6 out of 10. The numbers fluctuate from year to year, and I don't want a listener to get all upset and say, "Oh, that's not accurate." But between the high 40s of percentage and the low 60s, depending on your city and your jurisdiction and your state, murders are not solved. So let's say that's 55%. Let's say it's 60%. The number's too high. Let's say it's 10%. It's too high. But again, for listeners, roughly 60% of murders go unsolved. That means 6 out of 10 people 3 out of 5 people who commit a murder are never brought to justice. They get away with murder. And folks, I mean, that number is way too high, way, way, way too high. And so, I think the last chapter in my book is called non-denouement, right? There is no, at least so far, for my case and for tens of thousands of others, there is no tied up in a bow and the hour-long episode of CSI ends and you figure out who did it. There's nothing. And that is what is most frustrating for most families of murder victims.
Mike, that's a huge number. I'm shocked. I thought most murder crimes get solved. Your book provides a firsthand account of crime victims and what they go through in California every day. So many like you share their painful experiences dealing with the system as it is today. So what are some of the reforms, in your view, state and federal policymakers should be making to ensure that justice is served and served swiftly for the loved ones who are left behind?
That is a great, great question. And again, there's a lot to unpack there. So, what I start with in the book is the acknowledgement that death is a regular part of everybody's life, right? All of us have a loved one die at some point. The perspective that I try to give of a murder victim's family, though, is a little different. And I'm not saying a death is ever easy. It's always hard when a loved one dies. It is so hard, whether it's cancer or anything like that. People who die of old age or, a heart attack, those things are always hard. But, for most deaths, and I realize there are exceptions, car accidents and things like that. But for most deaths, when you have a loved one who is aging, or you hear that a loved one is coming down with, or has gotten cancer, you have a chance to say goodbye. You have a chance to ask them questions. You have a chance to comfort them and hold their hand and, and prepare yourself mentally and prepare them mentally. With a murder, and any other sudden form of death, of course, you don't have that. You just wake up one day and get a phone call and wow, boom, someone's out of your life. And that's the perspective that I try to give people, and I'm sure they can imagine that. I think anybody reading it can feel about that and what it's like. But and then as the family of a murder victim, there's a little bit of it that sort of robs your dignity, because if your relative died in a small police department where there are maybe 5 murders a year or a murder every decade, okay, well then you're probably going to get some personalized service. But the reality is, if you're like me, where your family member died in a busy jurisdiction, in many ways you just become a cog in the wheel. And I had a very interesting barometer for anybody that I dealt with when I was in public office, anybody who knew that I was in public office. If I was talking with a lobbyist, for example, that treated me like dirt, I would say, God, imagine how they treat my staff. If I was out and about and, giving a speech and, gosh, a plumber or a member of the public or a clerk at the DMV knew that I was in the legislature and treated me like dirt, I thought, my gosh, imagine how they treat the public. And that was my barometer. And I'm sorry to say that the same principle, applies here, which is, here I was, this high profile case, and here I was, sort of at the peak of my power and, very close friends with the mayor of LA. I could get the attorney general, who was Kamala Harris at the time, on the phone very easily. And yet the police still treated me at various times just like a cog in the wheel. And so I just had this profound thought, like, my gosh, how do they treat just the average person out there? And that was so, it to this day, it makes me so sad, because, I've met those other families of crime victims where, you're just begging for the police to think about this or think about that or pursue this or pursue that. And it's so hard sometimes to get their attention. So that's one thing that crime victims go through. But if I had to say that the worst thing that it is that crime victims go through is there is this trend in California that is probably about 20 years old, where the pendulum has gone so far towards the system now working for criminals that crime victims often feel forgotten. We feel forgotten. We feel like, that the system is, that reformers and so much energy and attention and media attention is for criminals. And I talk about this in the book, right? Do we have to, as a society, alternate between lock them all up and throw away the key and let them all out, let them go free? Do we have to alternate between that? Is it possible that there's a middle ground? Is it possible that we can live in in a world where policymakers, rather than there's, 50 bills in Sacramento on criminal justice and 49 of them are trying to make it easier for criminals to go free. Can we maybe have some balance? I mean, can we maybe have some meaningful discussions about it? I mean, even when I was up there, it felt like every piece of legislation that was proposed in the California legislature by my fellow Democrat, right? I mean, let's call a spade, that it was things like, well, this person committed a murder, but they were under 21. So their brain wasn't quite evolved yet. And maybe we should consider letting them go out of prison earlier. It was bill after bill after bill like that. Bill after bill reducing the penalties for a certain crime. Bill after bill reducing DNA testing. And I just thought, like, gosh, these are painful for me to vote on. And you imagine I at least had a, like I said, I'm so grateful. I have a platform, and I had a platform then, and I could try to persuade my colleagues. But imagine all the victims of the family members of murder victims out there who see this, and it's deeply symbolic. Year after year after year, there's another proposal to get rid of bail, to get rid of this, get rid of that, and make it easier for those who commit crimes or accuse of crimes. And it's at some point, it is really disheartening as the family member of a murder victim. And so, in terms of what do I think, what policies should state and federal folks be focusing on? Well, for one thing, the system is not great at tracking people who are accused of crime and who commit crimes. I think, for example, the recent efforts to reform bail are absurd. I think they're ridiculous. I think this idea that, somebody could be accused and arrested of a crime, which in and of itself is a pretty, you're not guilty. Of course you're not guilty. But there should be some consequence. There should be some degree of tracking that the system does. And the bail system is, for hundreds of years, it has been what we actually what we use. And I think this effort to reform that, I think is, just very, very ill-conceived. And I also think that, the way that reporters report about crime is also something that is just so imprecise, and it feeds on this idea that policymakers have that we need all of these pro-criminal reforms, right? What I tell people is you'll see these stories that say, well, crime is down. Despite all these reforms, crime is down. And I would say, what's your metric? Is it 911 calls? Because I'll tell you, there's parts of LA where people don't even call 911 anymore because they feel so powerless with the response. Is it dispatches? There are police forces up and down the state that are disheartened and they don't always dispatch a squad car anymore. Is it actually filling out a police report? There's places where people feel intimidated. There's places where people feel like it's useless. And frankly, there's police officers who feel like it's just a waste of time in the system right now. Is it open cases? Is it the police saying, okay, well, we've got now probable cause and we're gonna open a case, and or is it arrests? That's another thing, probable cause. Are you basing your metric crime is up, crime is down on the number of arrests? That's also something that is very much dependent on factors that have nothing to do with whether a crime was actually committed. Is it charges? I live in a county, Los Angeles, where the DA just doesn't charge a lot of people. So if you're saying crime is down, is that based on George Gascon? I mean, come on, right? Is it pleas? Is it convictions? Because, in some jurisdictions, you have DAs that are just, they're seeking much lesser charges, and that would make it look like felonies are down. And those things shape policy. So, what I would like to see as the family of a victim is more balance in Sacramento and more thoughtful laws that enable police to do their job, funding where police need it to do their job, and also, frankly, better reporting and a better dialogue when it comes to what it means when we talk about crimes being committed, because there are way too many murders that still occur and way too many murders that go unsolved.
Thank you so much, Mike, for sharing your story. And we certainly hope and pray that your father's murder gets solved. And you're really doing great work shedding light on these issues. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.